Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast. This is two podcasts in one. One where we dive into tons of interesting stories and books, and another where we just dive into tons of interesting topics. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, let's learn all about the Vikings. No, not the NFL team, the Minnesota Vikings, and no, not the purple people eaters of the 70s. The Vikings, the real Vikings. Do we really know them? When did they exist? How long did they exist? What did they do? Why are they important? Why are we still talking about them today? This is a shout out to Henry. Henry decided to read the Magic Treehouse book all about the Vikings. When Jack and Andy, if you're familiar with that series, they go back in their treehouse to the time of the Vikings. And I realized as he started talking to me about this and his interest in the Vikings, I said, you know what? I don't know enough about this time period. There's so much that we didn't learn in school, and I am one of them. So, let's learn together. So when you think of Vikings, what do you think of? Right? You think of that long ship, that serpent out in front. You think of the horns on the helmet. Certainly, I mentioned the football team, but that is the stereotype. That is the picture that we have, right? Some of it's true. Some of it's not. Yes, there's Thor. Yes, there's the Norse mythology. But there's Odin. There's Valhalla. There's Bluetooth. Yes, we'll get to that. There's Eric the Red, and there's Leif Erikson. And the bottom line, the word Viking means to raid. And that's where we're going to start our story. You have to go back 1,200 years, 793 A.D. June 8th. In that year, a group of Scandinavian warriors sailed across the North Sea and attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne. It was a small island off of England's northeast coast. Who lived there? Monks. They were completely unprepared. They were attacked. They were killed. They were taken as slaves. The raiders stole gold and silver. They carried away valuable religious objects. And news spread all over Europe immediately. People were horrified. God's holy places, if they weren't safe anymore, nowhere was. This attack was considered the beginning of the Viking Age. But here's something really important to know. They didn't just appear suddenly in 793. They had lived in Scandinavia for thousands of years. They had been building ships. They were fishers. They were farmers. They were traders. What changed was that they suddenly began sailing beyond their homeland. When they arrived on the scene, they changed Europe forever. But here's the other important thing you've got to know about the Vikings. Yeah, they actually were in North America. They discovered North America 500 years before Christopher Columbus. So where did they come from? I mentioned Scandinavia. Today, we know this as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. But back then, they weren't countries, unified countries. They were a collection of kingdoms ruled by local chiefs and kings. And guess what? Life wasn't easy. Remember, this is far north. It's very cold. The growing season is short. Their land is rocky. So once they ended up perfecting their long ships, they needed to get out, and they could. So let's stop here, because if you understand the Vikings, what you got to understand is their wooden ships. Yes, it's like their speedboat, this long ship. It was long, narrow, and built entirely for speed and surprise. They could move quickly with the wind, and if they didn't have the wind, they had the men with oars. And here's the specifics. It's this boat that is not stiff or thick planks. The wood is overlapping planks like roof shingles that are bent and they flex with the waves. This is the opposite of what a lot of boats were at the time. The wood was stiff, the planks were thick, and they cracked with big ocean waves. The bottom of the boat was super flat and it had a shallow bottom. It could float in just 3 feet of water. The typical boat at the time, again, deep bottoms, and it crashed into the sand if it got close to the shore. What all this meant is that Viking boats could cross the oceans and they could sail right up through shallow rivers and slide right up into the sand docks so the warriors could jump out instantly. Again, the typical boats were stuck out in the deep ocean water and had to park far away from the beach. Slick, quick, and most menacing of all was this tall wooden dragon head, this serpent head that you would see coming towards you. It was terrifying. But the legacy of the Vikings was not just as looters and raiders. They became remarkable and respected traders. And we're talking about moving from England west to Iceland, to Newfoundland, to Greenland, and yes, east. They not only were here in the New World, but they moved east as far as Baghdad and out to Constantinople. As a matter of fact, some historians believe that the name Russia comes from the Rus, which are Scandinavian traders and rulers who established themselves in Eastern Europe. Whether the word actually derived from the Old Norse term for rowers remains up in the air, but the bottom line is the Vikings' influence throughout the world was immense. Now, despite their reputation on the sea, they were basically farmers. Women had rights. Women could actually divorce their husbands, but they were the typical family unit. Their religion, well, it certainly shaped their everyday life. Before Christianity actually moved north, the Vikings followed what we call Norse mythology. Then their chief god was Odin. He was the wise one, the seeker of knowledge, the one who sacrificed an eye for wisdom. Then, of course, you've heard of this guy. It was Thor. He was the thunder god. He was the protector of humanity. And yes, he had that mighty hammer, and no doubt that's one of the most popular symbols in Viking society. And with my research, I also found out that they very often wore these amulets around their neck for protection. Another god, Freya. She was the goddess of love and battle. There was Loki, who was this clever trickster. But perhaps the greatest story in Norse mythology, which is going to be no doubt a story in a future episode, is Ragnarok. It was this final battle in which the gods and giants destroy one another before a new world rises again. I mean, don't underestimate this. Yes, Greek mythology is probably the most well-known of all the stories out there in Western civilization, but so many words and so many pieces of our culture today go back to the Vikings. Now, Thursday, what does that mean? It literally means Thor's day. Wednesday comes from Odin through the Anglo-Saxon god Woden, and Friday is named after Frigg, who is associated with Odin. So, like I said, no doubt we're living with the Vikings still today. Eventually, Christianity spread all across Scandinavia. Many Viking kings accepted baptism, and churches replaced these temples that the Vikings originally had. One of the most famous rulers was this gentleman by the name of Olaf Haraldsson, better known today as Olaf the Saint. After his death in the Battle of 1030, he was declared a saint, and Christianity spread even more rapidly throughout Norway. Some other famous Vikings. There's Ragnar Lothbrok. Did he really exist? Maybe, maybe not. Historians debate this, but his stories are legendary. No question. One of his sons continued the story in the saga, and his name was Ivar the Boneless. No one exactly knows why he was called the Boneless. Some believe he suffered from a medical conditions. Others think that he was flexible. Bottom line, he became famous because he was part of this great heathen army that invaded England. And then there's Harold Fairhair. He's remembered as the first king to unite much of Normandy. But no doubt, the two most famous Vikings, when you think of the Vikings, you got to think of Eric the Red. He was nicknamed the Red because obviously he had reddish hair. Maybe it was his temper, but he had been in Iceland. He was kicked off the island, no doubt a future episode, and he went west, and guess what he found? Another Iceland. But he was smart. He needed people to come over, so what did he call it? Greenland. Yeah, and it's still called Greenland today. Settlers followed. Eric founded Viking colonies there. And yeah, his son, who was Leif Erikson, also became famous. Around the year 1000, Leif sailed west again, and that's when he reached North America, as I mentioned before. It was probably Newfoundland. We're not 100% sure, but he called the land Vinland. Bottom line, archaeologists have confirmed that Leif Erikson and the Vikings established a settlement there. And like I said before, 500 years before Christopher Columbus came over. Now, if you talk about the Vikings, you have to talk about their influence on England. They first arrived as raiders. They attacked, like I said, the monasteries and the wealthy coastal towns and to steal treasures. That was what they did first. But eventually, instead of just attacking, they stayed. They put down roots in northern and eastern England, and they brought communities there. They ruled over large areas of the country, and they had their own Viking kings that actually ruled the entire nation. And yeah, they mixed their language with Old English. They gave us words like sky, window, knife, cake, and the words they and them. You can spot Viking influence in so many town names in England still today. If the town ends in BY, meaning farm or village like Grimsby, or Thorpe, meaning hamlet, well, guess what? That came from the Vikings. And also, again, the years we're talking about here is basically from the year 800 to a little bit past 1000. And here's the date you gotta know, 1066. Some Vikings settled in northern France. That region became known as Normandy. Literally, it means the land of Northmen. Over time, these Vikings adopted the French language and Christianity. Then, in 1066, their descendant, who was known as William the Conqueror, guess what he did? He invaded England. So was William a Viking? Not exactly. He wasn't a Viking raider, but he absolutely was descended from Viking settlers. You talk about the influence of Vikings in terms of the future. His great-great-great-grandfather was a Viking leader, and his name was Rollo. So, yeah, Viking history helped shape not only medieval England, but you can argue so much of modern Europe today in so many ways. So let's wrap up the podcast with a lot of different fun facts that you may have heard about Vikings. Number one, don't they have horns on their helmets? Nope, they didn't. This became popular during the 1800s with artists and costume designers. Well, they thought it looked good, but no, the real Viking helmets were simple. They had no horns on them. How about that word berserk? Have you ever heard of people going berserk? Well, berserkers, it comes from that word. And yes, berserkers were Viking warriors. They were so much into what they were doing People will talk about them being in a trance, like they were high going into battle. They were absolutely crazy. They ignored pain. They ignored the fear. They ignored everything in front of them. Historians still debate really exactly who they were, but no doubt they were the elite warriors. They were the ones up in front. And yeah, they were the berserkers. They played their own version of chess, very similar to the game today. What did they use? Certainly they had their swords, but they were specifically always having that axe. They often had long hair, groomed, wore beards. Their hair was braided very often. And yeah, their clothing was bright for those that could afford it. But the bottom line is they wore layers to keep warm, and they were impeccably dressed. So how and when did the Viking era end? Well, it didn't happen one day. It slowly faded away. Scandinavian kingdoms became more organized. Christianity became more of a factor. And European kingdoms became more defensive and stronger. And these raidings with their ships certainly became harder. And then came 1066. The king of Norway, King Haralda, invaded England. He won an early victory, but at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, he was defeated and killed. Most historians believe this was the symbolic end of the Viking Age. And yeah, weeks later, 3 weeks from this moment, was when William of Normandy crossed the English Channel and won at the Battle of Hastings and took over England for good. Yeah, I can't leave without mentioning this. Bluetooth? That's just not Wi-Fi where you're getting your signal from in your headphone listening to this. Nope. It's a Viking king. Viking King Harald Bluetooth. He was famous for uniting Denmark. Bet you didn't know that. So, the Vikings. They were raiders, but they were farmers, they were merchants, and yeah, they were great storytellers, they were kings, and yeah, they settled and found the New World before Christopher Columbus, so they're pretty important. Friends, thanks for taking this journey with me, learning all about the Vikings. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. Hit that plus button in the top right-hand corner of Apple Podcasts. That will subscribe you to the podcast so you can get episodes downloaded on your phone. We're trying to get out episodes every couple days. We are on YouTube. We are on Facebook. We are on Spotify. Love the reviews, the ratings. Until next time, have fun and keep learning.